2NURFM.com, a broadcast service of the University of Newcastle.
Being a Tuesday morning, we're joined by University of Newcastle Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes, and we're looking at state and federal politics. You may remember last Tuesday we did some speculating. We speculated on who could be the new leader of both parties. Well, it's been interesting in the last 7 days since we spoke, because it all started to unravel towards the middle of last week, where they were saying the numbers for our Prime Minister Julia Gillard aren't so strong at the moment, popularity-wise, and it's really swaying in the favour of the opposition leader. And so much so that they were asking the federal member for Maribyrnong, Bill Shorten, to maybe step up and look towards taking the leadership of the Labor Party. We're back again. It's interesting times.
Yes, good morning,
You must
Dave.
have read about that or heard about that in the papers late last week. What was your thoughts on that, Jim?
Well, my first thought is, when are they going to stop speculating on this? Because it's pretty well a done deal, barring some remarkable unforeseen happening, that the Labor Party is not going to win the next election come September. This would mean that the Prime Minister, as leader of the party, would more normally step down and clear the decks, so that they would then choose another leader of the party to regroup and head towards an election 3 or 4 years later. So, it seems to me that carrying on about the Prime Minister's leadership of the party, in terms of as some newspapers are saying, she needs to stand down for the good of the party, for the good of the country. It seems to me that this is just a dead issue. She's unlikely to remain leader.
You would think those with strong leadership aspirations would be just sitting back and waiting now to see what happens when she goes, and then if she has to step down, then they make their move. It would be silly to make your move now.
Well, that would be the logical process. I mean, in terms of taking the fight up to the opposition, she's probably the best that they've got. I mean, yes, she's not popular according to the opinion polls, but when you look at those opinion polls and think about who's saying we prefer Rudd to Gillard, many of those people are going to be voting for Abbott come the actual election. So it's not a very reliable guide as to whether Kevin Rudd would be the saviour of the Labor Party. And in many respects, I don't think anybody can save the Labor Party at the moment, because the tide of opinion, at least judging from the opinion polls, is running so strongly against the Labor Party that, like I said, it would take a minor miracle to turn all that around. Now, there is one possible scenario that you could, in a Machiavellian way, understand how it might unfold. And if you're a leader and have aspirations for leadership, say like Bill Shorten, then it might be, shall we say, politic to roll the current leader and put Kevin Rudd in place so that he leads them to the election
and loses,
which
and has to step down,
and then
and there's your two birds with one stone, isn't it?
In a sense, so that the next person with the aspirations to the leadership, whether it's Bill Shorten or Greg Combay or somebody else, the two former leaders are now completely out of the picture, because one's been deposed in office and the other one has been deposed via the election.
So that could be why we're hearing these murmurs that, let's let Rudd have another go.
That's I actually personally don't think that will happen, Dave.
What about the media, Bud? What about when it comes down to your Murdochs and your Fairfax? Why do you think they're beating the drum and leading this push to get it shaken up with that leadership of the Labor Party?
Why they're doing it is sort of more difficult to pin down. That they are doing it, and certainly now the Fairfax press has come in and taken a very strong anti-government stance. I think their particular economic investments, in the case of Fairfax and Gina Rinehart, has a clear interest in mining and is not happy with how the government has negotiated this and brought in the resources tax, which was brought in under Kevin Rudd, I might add, not brought in under Julia Gillard. And, for the Greens to say that they were disappointed that, this was bad policy, well, it came in pre-Gillard government and with the Greens' support. So, the Greens, in that respect, were being a little bit disingenuous. But to come back to the media role, they are continually, there seems to be a continuous, maybe there's a dearth of real political news, so that the best news, in a hope of selling newspapers, is rather... let's speculate on the leadership. Whether people in the Labor Party will follow that line, or whether they'll sit tight and take the fact that the election is more or less beyond their grasp, I don't think that anybody with any serious political analysis on this would see Kevin Rudd as pulling them back. They've got about 10 percentage points on a two-party preferred vote. They're 10 points down. They would need some really serious turnaround to bridge that gap. It's not totally impossible, but it is pretty well, I would think, beyond the bounds of
And it's been
of
said
reasonable
that he's not a
possibility.
not a team player really.
Well, that was certainly the case. People's experience of him in the first 12, 15 months of his prime ministership, and which was a major factor in his downfall. But also a major factor in his downfall was the fact that he came into the leadership largely on the basis that he had no factional allegiances. And in some respects, that was a real plus. And had he had, shall we say, some of the interpersonal skills that a good leader needs to keep all the different factions and interest groups within the party more or less aligned long enough so that they can get on, doing their job of governing, he didn't actually have any of that skill, and he alienated people across the board, so that the cross-factional alliances that he might have been able to sustain all fell apart. And so the fact that he had no factional support in any serious sense meant that this asset then turned into a liability. People owed him no allegiance, basically, and his style of leadership was certainly quite, as many of the ministers pointed out, and the senior public servants, was quite dysfunctional. And a couple of his major decisions, his back down, for example, over the carbon tax or carbon pricing and Kyoto, basically meant that he'd sort of stepped back from one of the things that he claimed was the major issue of his government, and he backed away from it. So that meant that when the chips were really down, when you need a leader who can stand firm, for example, and take the flak, take the heat, so to speak, and maintain their cool throughout, he just didn't have it. And I think we can see Julia Gillard certainly has demonstrated that capacity. It hasn't done her any good in terms of the opinion polls, but in terms of leadership quality, she certainly demonstrated that. And I would suggest that probably Tony Abbott has demonstrated that to some extent, and he's actually changing his tack. I think you can see now that he's projecting a more prime ministerial persona rather than the I'm the leader of the opposition and my job is to be negative. I think he's starting now, we can see that happening. He's starting to shift his ground, and he's projecting himself as a more moderate, more modest,
More statesmanlike.
more statesmanlike. Now, whether that is the reality or not, that's not for us to say. Excuse me, not for us to say at the moment. But he's certainly changing tack in a way that makes him a clearly credible alternative to the Labor government, and makes it harder for people within his own party then to see him as a liability come the election. At the moment, I would think within the Liberal Party, there's probably almost no chance that, say, someone like Malcolm Turnbull or others will be able to topple him before the election. Having said that, of course, nothing is ever certain in politics, so it's possible that it still remains on a distant horizon, perhaps, Dave. But I think at the moment, so long as he keeps putting his feet firmly one in front of the other without stepping outside the sort of the track that he's heading on, he's likely to remain leader, and he's likely to be the next Prime Minister.
Undoubtedly, we will hear more as we edge towards that Saturday, September 14 election date. Thank you, Jim.
My pleasure, Dave.
Joining us from the University of Newcastle, Associate Professor in Politics, Dr. Jim Joes, back again next Tuesday morning here at 2NURFM.